Welcome once again to Strategies for Living with author and international speaker Doug Sparks. In this episode, Doug will be continuing the discussion on the roots of postmodernism. And now, here's Doug.
Hello once again. Welcome everybody. Just as a quick recap, last time we were talking about the nature of postmodernism, and we got to the point where we were talking about the meta-narrative and the overarching stories. And it's in the overarching stories. This is important. The overarching stories is what helps us orient ourselves to the world, because it gives us something to reflect off of. And I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre, we talked about earlier, the existentialist French philosopher, who said, true lostness is when you have no reference point. True lostness is where you have no reference point. Now, I can relate to this at a lot of levels. One of the things that I like to do is long distance hiking. So, for example, here in Colorado, we have two major trails that go through Colorado. One is called the Colorado Trail, and it goes from a town called Durango up to Denver. And it's about 486 miles. And then the other trail is part of a bigger trail called the Continental Divide Trail. And the Continental Divide Trail is one of the three, what they call scenic trails in America. So there's the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the granddaddy of them all, the Continental Divide Trail going from Canada to Mexico. And the sweet spot of the Continental Divide Trail is Colorado. So it runs through Colorado, north to south, or south to north, depending which way you're going, and it's about 800 miles. Now, I've hiked that as well. I did it in sections. I didn't do it a through hike, but I did it in sections. And one of the things about the Continental Divide Trail, about 80% of it in Colorado is over 11,000 feet. And so it's a lot of high elevation, a lot of mountains, and hiking it is a pretty good challenge. But in many times, finding it was a challenge, because it's not like they built this really good trail. No, they've connected a bunch of trails together, and sometimes they don't get maintained for like a decade or more. And so you'd be going along. There's a lot of times in certain areas, I'd lose the trail maybe 6-7 times a day. You just would disappear. And if you weren't well oriented, if I didn't know I needed to kind of go that way without the trail, without anything to reference to, I would have been lost. And so this is what Sartre was talking about. And it's our meta-narrative that we have in our culture and in our societies. It's what gives us the reference point. So when postmodernity comes along and says there are no meta-narratives, and that gets wiped away, now we can understand why those who are floating in this postmodern soup from 40 down. And the reason 40-year-old people don't get as adversely affected is simply because they were too old. They were out of the system pretty much when it started coming in. The younger you get, and that's one of the reasons why the young people today, I'd say under 30, oftentimes feel disoriented. They don't know what to do with their lives. They don't have a reference point. There's no goals out there. There's nothing they're shooting for. It's been disrupted. And so, instead of judging them, we got to understand, hey, there's a reason why. There's an existential reason why they're feeling the way they're feeling. And it's not because they're lazy. It's not that. Well, maybe some of them are, but by and large, we'll assume they're not. Let's do it that way. So when you destroy the meta-narrative, then you lose the sense of orientation, and you can't orient yourself well. Now, it was actually, as I said, I was going to combine, but some of these guys, like Jacques Derrida, he was the one that really pushed the meta-narrative theme. And his quote was something like this: all meta-narratives must be deconstructed in order for man to be truly free. Now again, remember the progressives 100 and some years ago, they were promising, hey, trust us, man starting with man, One of the things that's going to happen is ultimate freedom, and that didn't work out so well. So here we hear it once again. The whole idea is if we can deconstruct these hierarchies in our culture, this through deconstructing the meta narrative, then we're going to have a chance at real freedom. Now, in Marxist societies, change came about as a result of revolution. In the postmodern society, they don't advocate revolution so much as what they intend to do is to deconstruct the hierarchies. Now, the hierarchies are those, like I said, those systems that have been built up. And there's multiple hierarchies, thousands of hierarchies that have been built up that carry and support and serve in a way the meta-narrative. So you tear away the meta-narrative, and then you start by deconstructing the social constructs, the things that we've created, and then you tear them down. Now, the way that you can tell that you have a social construct is because if you get to like the lowest common denominator, you usually end up with some kind of a binary. So it's simply binary means two factors. And so in a social construct, say where you have moral values, you'll end up where something is good or bad. Okay? If you have a social construct, say in science, something is true or it's not true. In science, for example, you have male and female as biological sexes. There's two of them, right? And so everything that has, or for example, in our society, we have law and order. We have under our Constitution, certain rights and blah, 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 and then it works its way down where we have laws. Well, law and order are a social construct. So that has to be destroyed. And so you begin working your way through, and you start by doing the best you can to destroy the binaries. So a couple of examples that are right in front of us right now. As much as many people wish that sex is a social construct where there's multiple interpretations. Remember, our buddy Wittgenstein not only had multiple interpretations for a text. Now the postmoderns have embraced that philosophy and said there are multiple infinite interpretations of everything. Nothing is absolute. Everything is subject to infinite interpretations depending on the individual. And so, for example, sex, biological is male and female. And that one is pretty hard to get away from. You either got XY chromosome or you got XX chromosome. I mean, that from a scientific point of view, that's it. So what do? Well, first of all, you have to tear down science. Science is a meta-narrative, so you tear that down. And then you do a little kind of a sleight of hand. That may be a little too harsh, but anyway, what you do is you don't talk about sex. What you talk about is gender. And so now, instead of having a male and female, which is a binary, you don't have it any longer. You have gender identity. And gender is a social construct. So guess what? It can be torn down. Anything that is a social construct can be and should be and will be, if they have their way, deconstructed, destroyed. And so now, sex is not binary, male or female. Sex is now identified, and the term, actually you don't hear the word sex very often, biological sex. What you hear is gender. And so gender is a social construct. It can mean anything of infinite interpretation. So you've deconstructed it. Another one might be law and order. Let's do that one. Law and order is where in your culture you have come up with certain laws, and they are social constructs, no question about it. But it's through law and order then that if you disobey the law, then you have criminality to that degree. And so law and order produces criminality, would be the opposite. So what you have to do then is say, you know what, we have to decriminalize criminality in order for it to break loose from the unjust and biased laws that were made primarily by white guys. And so the people that are suffering the most from this are minorities. And so what we have to do then is decriminalize a lot of these laws. So what do? Well, the way you start to deconstruct it is you get as many progressive district attorneys elected to office who will not prosecute the criminals in certain events. Now, I'm not saying they're letting everybody go, but we're hearing in our culture and in our society, there's a lot of cities that the police, they'll arrest a guy, charge him with a crime, and he's out on the streets the next day. And in many of our big cities, the crime rate is rising. Well, what's happening is they are deconstructing the idea of law and order. You defund the police, so that's one way to try to destroy it, and then you decriminalize the acts because the laws are bad. And so the thing you have to remember is there's no, like I said, there's no neutral ground here. It's not, you can't go in and tweak the system because the system itself is corrupted. And so you can't just say, okay, listen, obviously we're not the perfect culture, we're not the perfect society. There's a lot of stuff we can do to make it more just and make it more equitable and make it more this or that. Oh no, that conversation doesn't exist. Because like I said, the postmoderns have kind of pedal to the metal. We're done messing around with this, going through these cycles and nothing ever happens. We're going to make things happen this time. It is not, there's no negotiation. And have you wondered why you can't really carry on a conversation now? You can't have a dialogue with people because the reason they don't want dialogue is because when you dialogue, there might be a point where you can come to consensus. And they don't want consensus because consensus means we can find a middle ground. And for them, they're committed to deconstruct. The only way that a better world, let's put it that way, the only way that a better world can come about is if you completely deconstruct these hierarchies that are supporting a false narrative, meta-narrative. And so there's no middle ground here. And we're seeing it, we're watching it happen right in front of us. The other big one, of course, is race. Now, this is where another one of these lines of thought comes in, but it doesn't come in directly. The Frankfurt School, remember the critical theory guys? A lot of what they said was adopted by the postmodern philosophers. Some of it kind of came in a little differently. Derek Bell, who is a professor of law at Harvard, he's the one, I think it was in the 1980s, that coined the term the critical race theory. And the idea here is that in order to get equity and get the racism out of our culture and society, we have to deconstruct race. So previously, race was often thought of as a biological consequence. But through Bell and others, they've redefined race as a social construct. Aha, if it's a social construct, then it can and should and will be destroyed, torn down. So the way you get rid of racism is do away with race. The way you get rid of sexism is do away with sex. So this is the modus operandi of the postmodern world. And you can see where this is that cataclysmic shift. No longer do we carry, and as I mentioned earlier, postmodernism should really be anti-modernism. Anything that came out of the modern era is suspect. And they will convert it into a social construct, and they will do their best to destroy it. So that's what we're beginning to see. out front, and there's a lot more coming. This is just the beginning. So we're beginning to see these themes in our society and our culture that are being exhibited, and we are now understanding, hey, what's the story in back of this? One of the other things that they deconstruct is morality, good and bad, true and untrue. And the reason, the way that you deconstruct that is you just say, listen, there is no such thing as, the assumption is there is no such thing as morality. Morality is a social construct, so it has to be deconstructed. So once you do that, remember Huxley's quote that I read to you about why would we want to do this? It just so happens, now maybe hope so happens may not be that the right term, but coincidentally, let's put it that way, during the 1970s, I think it was, that both Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida both signed a petition to the French government to do away with a minimum legal age for sex among minors. So you ask yourself, why would they want to do that? Well, you don't have to scratch very far to find that Foucault had been charged early on when he was living in Tunisia, or at least in North Africa, that he was having sex with young boys. And so what would be his motivation to want to do away with a minimum age for sex with children? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. Diderot, on the other hand, was quite the womanizer, and I'm sure he had his own reasons for wanting to do away with this. Now, it could have been just, coincidence, and he could have just been, trying to fight for kids' rights. You don't know. But there's always something in there that when somebody takes a position, it's usually much more than just the reason that is stated. And so when you look at postmodernism altogether, we've got to say, well, what do they consider true? We've looked at, the church gave us truth, reason gave us truth, science gave us truth, modernity kind of skipped over truth, it was whatever. But in postmodernism, where it ends up to be true is opinion. So there are no facts. And again, when you deconstruct science and deconstruct the meta-narrative of science, then you don't have facts, you only have opinion. And no one opinion is any better or any worse than anybody else's. And so we're drawing, again, infinite number of opinions, all of them being equal. Now, as this starts to be torn down, the other thing is they've done away with the idea of objective reality. In other words, there is no reality outside of yourself. So the only reality that exists is what you perceive to be real. And then, of course, you use your opinion to state what you perceive to be real, and that is real to you. And then no conversation, no dialogue. We don't want consensus. You just have to live with it. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that this heads towards anarchy. If you do away with all the laws, you do away with all the facts of science, you do away with all of the morality, you do away with that, then are humans truly free? Now, it would be okay if our human nature had the proclivity to only do good. I guess, of course, when there's no morality, there's no good or no bad. So if we had the proclivity that humans would act in such a way that would only benefit every other human, and then you gave them total freedom, maybe it would work. But we all know human nature is not doesn't have the proclivity to only do the best for everybody else. Human nature is what's best for me often. It's the one that says, that I'm going to take care of me. I've got a responsibility for me. And oftentimes in our culture, well, no, there's people who are just mean, for lack of a better, they're psychopathic. They don't have any sense of feeling bad about doing anything to anybody. And so if you can trust in human nature that it's only going to do that which prospers and helps everybody else, then, good luck, but I guess you can impose then and take for granted what the postmoderns are offering us. Now, here's the other thing that makes it quite interesting. And again, I think it was Michel Foucault. I could be wrong. It could have been Lyotard. But anyway, one of the guys put forth this, that anybody who resists or anybody who pushes back against this philosophy are considered, in his word, terrorists. And so to not go along with, to not be a part of this, get in the flow of it you automatically, according to them, become a terror. You're a terrorist. You're creating terror in the society, and you should be silenced. Now, again, do you wonder why we have such a hesitancy in our culture today to raise any opposition to this? To say, no, I don't think that your assumptions are true. You can make them, it doesn't make them true. And I stand in opposition to tearing down and destroying the entire culture so that you can hopefully bring about something better. And you can't do that in our culture today because you're going to get ramrodded. I think it was Rowling, who was one of the greatest, most popular authors in the last decade or last century maybe, who merely came out and made a statement that wasn't particularly pejorative, and she was blackballed and absolutely castigated. And again, as a terrorist, you got to get rid of him, move him aside. And so at this point in our culture, we're in a very interesting and very complex time in which we need to stand and tell the truth as best we can. They're not saying there is no truth. We're saying, yeah, there is. Now, one other thing I just want to talk about briefly here, I'm just going to brush on it, and that is politically correct speech. And I've got to thinking about this, and I wonder where that came from. What's the origin of that? Well, actually, it went back to 1917 in the Leninist Marxist revolution that took place in Russia. And at the time, they were trying to get their ideology into the culture. And so they knew that ideas create thoughts, thoughts create language. Well, maybe the reverse would be true too. If we controlled and coerced certain language, maybe it would then control their thoughts, and then they can embrace the ideology easier. And so there was coerced speech, which was words you had to use in describing certain elements and aspects of the culture. So that's where it came from. That's the origin of it. Now today, back in again the 80s or so, political correctness, political correct speech was reintroduced as the concept of, you know what, we don't want to be cruel, we don't want to be mean, we don't want to be judgmental about people, particularly who have disabilities or people who have a different race or a different ethnic persuasion. Oh, by the way, there's no such thing as ethnicity now either, but of a different whatever. And we don't want to speak words that would be harming to them or demeaning or marginalizing them. Now that was the context of why politically correct speech was introduced in the 80s. Now you can take it at face value and say, okay, yeah, fair enough. But you can also take it as, well, maybe that's another way to sort of soften up the surface, as it were. So if we can get people to use politically correct speech, it'll help them embrace the proper thoughts, which will support the ideology that's being pushed forth. And so we're facing now in our culture, and we're seeing it all around us, this postmodern tsunami that's coming towards us. And so the question that we need to ask is, who's pushing this agenda? How is this happening? How is this transpired? It seems like just, a few years ago, 5-10 years ago, we didn't have any of this chaos. We didn't have any of this disorientation, or not as much anyway. Where did this come from? Who's pushing the agenda? And so join us in our next episode, and we're going to take a look. Who are the agenda pushers? Who are the guys in back of this that's making it happen? And so we hope you'll join us next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time on Strategies for Living with Doug Sparks.